offshore wind is a success story. It's shown itself to be a relevant, necessary part of the energy mix going forward.
Welcome everybody. Today we're joined with Jonathan Cole from the chair of GWEC.
The world needs more energy. And you've got these big hyper-scaling events going on, like the growth of AI, which are changing the way in which the energy needs. It's not just good for the environment, it's actually really good for the economies and for the industrial landscape.
Why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself, and we'll get things started.
Sounds good, Philip. Well, great to be here with you, first of all. So as you said, today I'm the chair of the Global Wind Energy Council, which is the trade body of trade bodies for wind energy globally, and it's the primary advocacy body for wind energy at large organisations like the UN and things like that. That's a non-executive role. For the past 20 years, I've also been doing a lot of executive roles in the energy sector. So most recently, I was the founding CEO of a global offshore wind developer called Corio Generation, and I left that role a couple of months ago. And then prior to that, I was working for about 15 years in Iberdrola, the large Spanish utility, one of the global leaders in renewable energy. And in that role, amongst other things, I was involved in setting up and then running the global offshore wind business of Iberdrola for about 12 years. So long time in the energy sector, long time particularly in the offshore wind space.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jonathan, I know we've known each other over the years and always ran into each other. But yeah, thank you for all that you've done for offshore wind. It's been really amazing. So tell us, how did you get into offshore wind? What kind of triggered, the early days?
Well, first of all, I'd be lying if I said it was something I always wanted to be in, because when I was starting my career, there was really no such thing as offshore wind. And the reality is I probably found my way into it with a little bit of good luck and I guess a little bit of hard work as well. So I had been working actually as a lawyer. I started my career as a lawyer, mostly doing infrastructure type projects, big regeneration schemes, and then found my way into energy, and in particular into renewable energy at a time when renewable energy was only just really starting to kick off at scale. And at that time, most of the effort was in onshore wind. And at quite a young age, I became the legal director in Scottish Power at Iberdrola, just at the time that Iberdrola were buying Scottish Power. And I guess that's the first time I had a kind of senior role in anything to do with renewable energy. I have to say, I didn't deliberately choose to go into that as a career initially, but once I started getting involved in it and started working with the companies and the people involved, I definitely found it was a home from home for me. So I guess I'd always looked for something that I could do that allowed me, to work in quite a purpose-driven way. Something where you could work in something where you felt was actually having an impact and actually meant something. And I think when you work in renewable energy, you find that. So through my role in Iberdrola, initially working in onshore, I kind of found my way into a strategy team that was looking at how to get into offshore wind, and then from that ended up leading Iberdrola's offshore wind business, which was the start of a amazing journey and hopefully a lifelong relationship with offshore wind.
Yeah, no, that's very exciting, and you touch on some really, some things that we have in common. Obviously, offshore wind allows us to be active in something purpose-driven and really making an impact and creating a lot of jobs and economic development as well. Why did Iberdrola want to get into offshore wind at that time?
It's a really good question, Philip, actually, because Iberdrola at that time was probably by some distance the market leader in onshore renewables. So this is probably before the big Chinese run into renewables. So Iberdrola was one of the most visionary companies of its day, who kind of were the earliest mover and had grown this hugely impressive onshore renewables business. And I guess there were a lot of questions actually. Well, why would Iberdrola need offshore? But I think what offshore wind offered to a big organisation like Iberdrola was the ability to push its business on and grow further, because it was offering entrance into some really good, strong markets in Europe and in other places. It was offering large-scale opportunities, so big companies like Iberdrola like to go into things at gigawatt scale, not megawatt scale, and that's what offshore wind could offer. It actually offered a great deal of predictability as well, because we were able to build a business plan where you could see more or less 10 years in advance how many billions of euros you were going to be investing in growing the business. And although the risk profile in offshore wind is quite a particular one, it lends itself to companies with large patient balance sheets and with the ability to manage through kind of electoral and regulatory cycles, and also that can manage big projects. And so it was right in the sweet spot of a company like Iberdrola, and it offered them the ability to really grow their business. And the facts speak for themselves. Iberdrola is now one of the most relevant players in the offshore wind sector globally on the back of what we created.
Which begs the question, why is offshore wind so important to the energy transition? I get that question a lot, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
I think there's a lot of factors to offshore wind that I think make it extremely important to the energy transition. Especially in markets with large coastline and maybe limited opportunity to grow renewables onshore. So, what offshore wind is offering you is the ability to, at a relatively quick speed, bring online huge quantities of clean, green, affordable, reliable power. In most markets, it's allowing you to produce that power very close to the demand centre. So if you look at, you could say that in the UK, you could say that off the northeast coast of the United States, for example. And therefore, to bring the power to market to where it's needed, without causing a lot of complications back in the onshore transmission system, it also offers a pretty healthy complementarity to the other renewable sources. So, things like solar and onshore wind, because it doesn't have the seasonal variability of solar, and it does. The seasonal variability of onshore and the kind of day and night variability of solar. It's a much more steady resource. So it fits very well into the system of markets where you've got these large demand centres near the coast, and you've got nice shallow water with strong winds, and that's why countries that have that opportunity are doing their best to exploit it. The other really exciting thing about offshore wind, and this has been happening, in most markets, is it's offering an opportunity for growing industrial benefit as well. And let's be honest, quite a lot of the Western democracies have, got these post-industrial and coastal communities that haven't quite had the level of investment that the big cities have been having. And offshore wind's giving an opportunity to breathe life back into them and create, long-term, meaningful, skilled, well-paid jobs as well. So it's not just good for the environment; it's actually really good for the economies and for the industrial landscape in the countries that it's in. And that's why offshore wind is still very popular. And despite the current challenges, and I'm sure we'll talk about these at some point in this conversation, far-sighted politicians who really know where the future is heading are still believing in offshore wind and still wanting to support it, because they see that potential still exists despite these short-term challenges.
And we're definitely seeing more activity in both mature markets, and then you're seeing quite a few emerging markets coming on. It makes me think of Australia and how quick they've moved up, and eventually, obviously, the proximity to the load centers makes a lot of sense, even though there's a lot of geography there.
There's a great example, Philip. I mean, if you take Australia, you could at first glance say, well, why does Australia need offshore wind? Because it's got a huge amount of land mass. It's got quite a lot of land mass behind the load centres onshore. And so the opportunity for things like, solar and onshore wind is there in abundance. But then if you look at particular parts of Australia, in Victoria, the state of Victoria is a great example. You've got a real sweet spot there where you've got these areas of coastline with shallow water, good seabed conditions, very strong constant winds, so lending themselves perfectly to offshore wind. You can feed that power onshore into an area which is already industrialised and has got grid connections, because it's been a fossil-based energy centre of Australia for a long time, and you can utilise that and become the successor to those ageing fossil plants. And then along the way, then you can ensure then that all that industrial activity that goes on down there can continue. So when you look at particular parts of Australia, you say, well, actually, offshore wind makes perfect sense there because it gives you the power you need at a price you can live with, and it's creating jobs and opportunity, and it's utilising existing infrastructure. And by the way, if you talk about New York, you talk about Massachusetts, you talk about, a lot of these northeastern states in the United States, you can make the exact same argument, and okay, maybe in other parts of the US offshore wind isn't necessary, but up there, where it's not so easy to produce onshore renewables, where the transmission system is complicated and expensive, actually being able to bring that power straight into the cities makes perfect sense, and it still does. And that's why the governors, I think, in those states are still so keen to see that offshore wind survives this, current problem that we're seeing.
We've spent quite a bit of time in Australia as well, and then in the US. One thing I often say is, it's going to be pretty hard to put a nuclear plant in the middle of New York, right? So, and then building all those transmission lines or even the pipelines for gas is going to be challenging, even though we're still going to have gas for quite some time. But maybe just backing up a second to look at the offshore wind sector globally. We stand today at 85 gigawatts of installed capacity globally. GWEC has recently launched their the report. Give me a little bit of kind of the status of offshore wind globally, and then we'll get into all the geopolitical issues that it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on how that's going to play out.
Yeah, well, so I think one thing it's quite tempting to do, by the way, right now when you're talking about offshore wind or even other aspects of renewables, is to fixate on how it feels at this moment in time, being in this sector, and think that this is a sector that has some kind of question mark over its future. And that's not the case. I mean, first of all, you have to contextualize this, right? This is a 50-year program to decarbonize the global economy and how we power ourselves. And that 50-year program sounds really long, but actually that requires year by year, day by day activity to keep us moving towards that. And if you look at what's been achieved in offshore wind over the past 15 years, it's remarkable that we've grown from a nascent technology that, there's big question marks over whether the technology would work, whether the logistics to install it were capable of being managed, whether the cost could get to an affordable level, whether when those turbines were out at sea, they would be survivable and reliable enough. And, and one by one, those questions have been answered in the positive, and offshore wind has grown, as you say, to more than 80 gigawatts of installed capacity globally. So it's it's shown itself to be a relevant, necessary part of the energy mix going forward, and that's a big success story and something we should be very proud of. It's also along the way created huge amounts of jobs, huge amounts of investment in onshore infrastructure, including in ports and facilities like that that entire coastal communities rely upon those ports to be busy to keep the communities economically active, and offshore wind is supporting all of that as well. So I think the people who work in offshore wind should feel incredibly proud of what we've done. We've upscaled a technology and brought it to market at the kind of rate at which consumer electronic technology comes in, and we've brought the price down at the kind of rate that consumer electronic technology brings the price down. But somehow we've done it with big infrastructure, and we've done it with huge bits of kit and huge logistical challenges, and that's something to be super proud of. So I think offshore wind is a success story. Now, it's true right now, because of macroeconomic issues, because of some regulatory and political issues, it feels like it's a difficult place to be, and maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. But overall, I think offshore wind's very successful and will continue to be so. You can look around right now, the big companies still participating, and the big market's still keen to pursue to see that it's not just people like me that say that. There's a lot of decision makers who say the same thing.
Yeah, so maybe let's jump right in. So we have a new administration in the U.S., very anti-offshore wind. We've seen them recently stop the Equinor project, during construction. We have inflation challenges.
Sorry, Philip, to interrupt you. I don't know what happened there, but just as you said, let's jump right in, I got this sound coming across, and I couldn't hear the question at all. So maybe.
Okay.
Do you mind just going back to it? Let's jump right in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry about that.
No worries. No, sorry about that. So Yeah, I was suggesting, I was saying, let's jump right in. We have a new administration in the U.S. that is, very, opposed to offshore wind. They've canceled, the Equinor project, during construction, which is something that I would say is unprecedented. It'll be interesting to see how that scenario plays out. We're also dealing with inflation, and other supply chain challenges. How do you see the evolution of these geopolitical and other industry issues evolve? How do you see that's going to play out?
Oh, so let's take it first of all away from single administrations or the actions of single organizations, and let's just look at the global aspect of it. So, all right, offshore wind as a technology had really thrived on the back of technology gains and cost of capital reductions, right? And that's how we were able to achieve the level of cost reduction that we had, right? Now, those technology gains were funded by private organizations, the technology companies, the OEMs, over a period of time where they were moving very quickly through the technology cycle to bring those new technologies to market. And then what's happened more or less the same time is that the things like COVID and other inflationary pressures have made life very difficult for those big technology companies, to the extent that they're having to work really hard to return their businesses to profitability, and therefore having to be very disciplined in what they do, how they do it, how they price it, and also very disciplined about how and when they move their technology forward. And that's happened at the same time as cost of capitals went up significantly, by several percentage points. So it's natural then that an industry that relies on technology and on cost of capital being low to thrive is going to struggle when you hit a point in time when the technology starts to level off, when the supply chain is hurting and its ability to invest in itself and its efficiency is starting to be hindered, and cost of capital is going up. And that's why you see these challenges. I mean, to put the cost of capital thing into some kind of context, if you take a 1 gigawatt offshore wind project in a typical market and you add 1% onto the cost of capital, it's almost like you're adding $250 million onto the capital investment cost, right? And that's equivalent to adding about $10 per megawatt hour onto the electricity price, the levelized electricity price for 15, 20 years. So if you're in a world where you've got 3 or 4% increase in cost of capital, that's like a $1 billion cost increase and a $40 tariff increase. And that it's not just, by the way, offshore wind, which has seen cost increase and increase in the end product price. That's happening across the whole economy. So there's no reason why offshore wind should be immune to that, nor should offshore wind be the only part of the economy that isn't allowed to reprice itself. So that's why we are where we are. But the fact is that these things will resolve themselves. This is a cycle. It's a cyclical business. It always has been. And this is a point in the cycle where all of these issues are coming together at once. But the fact is, cost of capital is starting to come back down, and that's going to help. The supply chain issues are starting to resolve themselves. Inflation is starting to level off. A lot of the big technology companies are returning back to profitability. And so with the right market conditions still in place, people still seeing the growth trajectory and, seeing a price for the end product that makes it profitable, you can see how things will return back again and the cycle will turn back in our favour. And that, I think, is a natural, quite logical thing to assume. Now, what will affect that, and let's be honest, what is affecting that, is if because of some kind of, distortion in the market, whether it's a regulatory or political intervention or something else, if somehow that market is interrupted, so the outlook for the market and it's, the investability of the market or the profitability of the market is being systematically undermined, what that does is it further hinders the period for the return to health of the suppliers in that market. It calls into question their capacity to invest in further, efficiencies and technologies, and it increases the risk profile and therefore the cost of capital again. And a lot of those gains that we were hoping to see come back again might not come for another year or two down the line. And so when you see these kind of, moments in time where you've got administrations, the US is one of them, that is not supporting offshore wind and therefore confounding a lot of very legitimate expectations, then that's going to have an impact. But it's only going to have a short-term impact for as long as that's allowed to happen. And, and then, hopefully things will turn back. So, I mean, what I would say about that, and maybe we can come on to that in a minute because you talked about geopolitics, but what's really important then is that we don't allow single markets to just dominate the global market. What we need to have is those willing parties, those willing markets to keep moving the industry forward. Because I think that's what's really important for this energy transition is that it's, it doesn't stop because of certain, the actions of certain states. It is allowed to carry on because building infrastructure requires continuity and stability, and that's what we need to try our best to achieve. And if one market isn't providing it, what we really need is other markets to step up and do it.
Just to highlight a couple of thoughts, electrification continues, demand for electricity, whether it's AI or data centers or electric vehicles, or, we're continuing to obviously see massive growth. And, in our conversations with investors, they're thinking beyond, the next 1 or 2 or 3 years. Long-term investors are still very encouraged and interested in investing in the space. And to your point, we are seeing the cost of capital come back down. Those are definitely very encouraging. Talk a bit about the trade and supply chain dynamics, as you see them, and how do you see that play out in the coming years?
So I think it's really important, your point there, Philip, right? Which is that the world needs more energy. And you've got these big hyper-scaling events going on, like the growth of AI, which are, changing the way in which the society and the economy of the future will perform, but also changing the energy needs. And so, regardless of what you think about renewable energy versus fossil versus nuclear, what these big hyperscaling technologies need is fast availability of reliable, affordable energy where they can see a stable price across the long term, right? And the fact of the matter is that is still what renewables provides. It provides the fastest ability to bring new power to market. Once it's been installed, it provides a very stable price because it's not reliant on, wholesale gas prices and that type of thing. And we know with the right technology there in terms of interconnection, in terms of storage and, other things, it can be a very stable, reliable source of electricity as well. So all that means that this has to happen still. The world of the future needs much more power than it has today, and it's not going to get it reliably and safely and affordably from the energy sources of the past, right? And so that's still an inevitability. So that's the first thing. I mean, the second thing, just again, we were talking about geopolitics, and this will come back onto the trade question in a minute. But one of the things that I think you're seeing right now, which is unfortunate, from just I guess from the point of view of how the whole energy transition is playing out, but also in the short term causing issues, is that there's a lot of big multilateral organizations who are extremely important and supportive in the energy transition that are being systematically undermined and even vandalized. So things like UN, COP, the G20, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, all these big bodies are really important because they were creating the international consensus around the need for decarbonisation, the need for the energy transition. And there was a lot of multilateral effort going on, almost universal. If you look at what happened in COP28, COP29, you've seen a huge amount of support for and recognition for the need for renewable energy to be grown in the system. And so as we see those bodies being undermined or discredited, I think it starts to have an impact then on how multilateral organizations are going to be able to take the next step they needed to take, which is to practically implement a lot of the enablers for the energy transition, especially in emerging markets and developing economies, right? So what does that mean? What that means is that actually we're probably going to need to move a bit more into a world, at least in the short term, of plurilateralism. What I mean by that is regional coalitions and coalitions of the willing who are actually wanting to keep moving forward, who see the importance of this, who still believe in this and want to keep moving forward. And so I see big organizations like the European Union and big economies and big, high population countries like Brazil and India, South Korea, Japan, Australia, countries like that, the UK, having a big role to play in keeping the energy transition moving forward and somehow ensuring the health of the industry, not just for their own internal markets, but then the byproduct of that will hopefully keep it healthy and moving for when, the other markets start to get moving again. So I think from a geopolitical point of view, we're in a real sensitive point where we almost can't rely on multilateralism anymore to get things done. The best we can hope for is that multilateralism protects international norms and standards, which will lead into trade discuss in a minute. And then actually it's more regionally that you get things done. And I think that's probably how we should hope this moves forward. And I think you see quite a lot of discussion on that basis already emerging at the kind of, in the international community, talking about how we can still move forward and what regional blocks can achieve.
Just to echo that point, the UK and Germany being the largest markets outside China, we're definitely seeing activity there, and emerging markets like Brazil, you mentioned. I mean, those are definitely, we're definitely seeing collaboration amongst those regional hubs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the past 2 years, the big five markets have been China, Germany, India, Brazil, and the US, right? So take the US out of that maybe, and you still see four markets still very hungry to keep growing and keep moving. And so that's and that's by general on wind, not just offshore wind. But yeah, I mean, that's the way things are. By the way, on that, one thing you have to recognise is that, more than 85% of all activity in wind energy installation has happened in China, Europe, and the US over the past couple of years as well. So there's an over concentration in certain markets that probably needs to be addressed. So if you start to look at the contribution of other parts of Latin America or of Sub-Saharan Africa, whatever, it starts to look like things are not moving the way they need to. So there's a lot of work to be done, but still, you've got these big markets who I think are keeping us moving, and that's good, especially in offshore wind, where we need a few big markets. And I think in offshore wind, the North Sea basin will continue to be the engine room of offshore wind over the next few years. And China and the North Sea basin is probably where most of the activity is going to be in offshore wind installation between now and 2030. And by the way, in the GWEC report, offshore wind is still predicted to grow a compound annual growth rate of 27% year after year over the period from now to 2030. So that's about 4 times the growth rate of onshore wind, by the way. So although offshore wind feels tricky and it's going to be a bit more concentrated in a smaller number of markets, it's still a growing market. And, so we're still, there's still opportunities and plenty to do for the people who are working here.
Trade and supply chain. So yeah, love to hear your thoughts. How's that going to play out, especially given the current geopolitical environment?
So I think that in our industry, it is a multinational industry where the kit that we need to install and the services that we need to install it are coming from all over the world. And with the exception of China, there's no single market that has the ability to entirely supply itself with what it needs to install offshore wind, or at least to do it in any kind of affordable way. So industries like offshore wind really rely on a system of fair trade, free and fair trade. So of course we need to have trading rules, of course we need to have trading norms, of course we need to hold everyone to certain standards. But in general, protectionism and overly onerous or local content restrictions that don't make sense for that local market are not helpful, because what they tend to do then is just mean that this takes longer and costs more money in the end to the consumer. And so, I've always been, and GWEC has always been, an advocate for free and fair trade. Now, over the past few years, that argument has become quite an emotive one because of the way in which China has started to dominate the energy transition landscape. Probably every aspect of the energy transition, where they're talking about wind, solar, batteries, electric vehicles, China probably controls more than 60% of the market in every one of those technology aspects, and that's been a systematic move by China to grow its capability, and not just create companies and technology, but to actually create whole systems that make that the case. And now you can see the result of that. Now, that poses a big dilemma to a lot of the Western democracies, because there's a legitimate question there about their own national interests being served if too much of these critical supplies are sitting outside of their own control. I think that's a perfectly legitimate question to ask yourself. And so more could be done and should be done to try to, rebalance a bit the global supply chain so that it doesn't become so concentrated or dominated in one particular place. Now, what it doesn't mean is that you necessarily need to say that everything coming from China is bad, or that we can't buy from China. I mean, in fact, if you tried to do that, you would stop overnight the wind industry, because probably even the Western turbines have got more than 50% of their kit coming from China right now. And for sure, you would make it a more expensive process. I mean, actually, GWEC did a supply chain report last year, and it basically said that if you take all the regions of the world and look at their growth, by about 2026, that's next year now, every region except for China has critical components being undersupplied. And only China manages to get all the way through the period to 2030 without that undersupply. So you've got a market there with an oversupply and every other market an undersupply. What do you do about that? You either buy from the oversupply market or you stimulate enough capacity in your own market. But that won't happen by accident. That needs big fiscal intervention, a really deliberate strategy to support businesses. And protectionism is probably not the way to achieve that. You need to do something a bit smarter and actually try and create competitive local supply chains rather than try to lock out external supply chains. So that's always been a big issue for us, is how do you try and promote free and fair trade, but do it in a way that still allows people countries to act in their own national interests and protect themselves. The other thing that happens quite a lot, by the way, is that cybersecurity is very often used as a proxy in that debate, as being something that means we shouldn't be buying from somewhere like China because of cyber risk. I mean, what I would say to that is there needs to be a lot more analysis done, but there is probably a technical solution. In fact, there's plenty of parties right now who say they have a technical solution that allows you to ring fence and keep control of components, whether bought from China or not, within your own jurisdiction, and therefore mitigate that cyber risk. But I mean, the other thing I would say is you would be deluding yourself if you thought that's a risk that only existed in the wind energy space. It exists in every network component and every aspect of infrastructure. And if it really is a legitimate concern, then we've got a problem, because most of the Western kind of infrastructure is already then exposed to that risk. So I feel as if sometimes it's something which is used and abused by parties who just want to talk down renewable energy without actually, going to the ability to solve it. So that's been the historic big issue with trade. It's all about how do you promote healthy, competitive global supply chains and make it free and fair trade. It doesn't get dominated by one market, for sure, and that doesn't allow one market to deploy unfair trade practices, but that keeps the markets open and doesn't subscribe to protectionism. I think that's where we're trying to get to. And then I guess, recently we've had a whole new aspect of the trade question brought up. I don't know if you want to touch on that, but what's been coming out of the US.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about tariffs. How do you see, in the near term, obviously volatility, uncertainty, unpredictability is something that investors don't like at all. And we've seen that, especially impacting the US market across renewables and definitely offshore wind. But how do you see that playing out over the next, coming years?
Well, so I think it is, again, it's unhelpful to see that kind of approach, because the tariffs of that nature that are hard to predict, not easy to quantify, not easy to see the rationale behind them, then make it very difficult to plan against. And that somehow undermines then this concept of free and fair trade. And then if we start getting into a system where we've got retaliatory tariffs and other distortions in the market to try and compensate for that, then the whole system starts to become very unpredictable. And as you know very well, Philip, unpredictability equals higher cost of capital, which eventually equals higher cost of electricity, which, harms us all. So I think it's something that, it's regrettable, and I hope that somehow this is all resolved in the right way. And I guess what needs to happen then, as I said earlier on, is that those regional blocks, those coalitions of the willing, need to somehow find a way to carry on away from that environment and try to keep open trading channels in the right markets, in the right regions to try and keep things going on. It's all, you also hear a lot right now about, the kind of strong pushes for countries to buy LNG and things like that in order to, obtain some other kind of benefits or support, which is probably also quite a challenge for the energy transition, because it's then, kind of pushing certain economies to buy LNG whether they want it or not, and then they somehow have to utilize it, and that increases their, kind of exposure to the dollar in a part of their economy they didn't particularly want to be spending their foreign currency on. And it also means that it slows down their conversion to renewable energy because they've got all, this other, LNG to deal with. So I think that, that type of thing as well is undermining a lot in the emerging markets, their ability to transform, which is a real shame. So again, I hope that we get to somewhere sensible at some point. I mean, at the end of the day, as I said, this is a 50-year program to decarbonize the planet. These are a few years of real, difficulty that are we're experiencing right now. But I think in the story of the energy transition, probably, these few years won't actually have that much, noteworthy mention. But it's as long as we carry on through this and keep trying to, keep the industry healthy where we can.
Yeah, and that's a good way to contextualize it. This is a journey, and obviously we have some turbulence, over a little bit of that time. So maybe it brings me to the question, what's a call to action? I mean, with some people would say misinformation, and some of the aspects we're seeing, obviously headlines and so on. What can people do? Whether it's industry folks in the offshore wind industry, or investors or others, what can they do to combat some of that, or really kind of, rally together to get over this turbulence in this, short period of time to make sure we continue the momentum with the transition?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And for as long as I've been involved in renewable energy, we've always had this issue. We've never been great at talking outside of our own industry about, who we are, what we do, why we do it. I mean, we're great at going to our own conferences and convincing each other how righteous we are and how great we are, but we somehow don't win the argument, too far into the rest of society. I think part of that is because we continuously change the way we describe ourselves, and we've kind of flip about a bit depending on what the prevailing narrative is, and so we're not very consistent. And partly, I think, we're all very data-driven, scientific, people who really believe in why we're doing it, why we're doing what we're doing, etc., etc. But actually, you don't tend to win that many public arguments, especially emotional-led arguments with data and reason. You need to win them, actually by hooking people in on the emotional side and make them want to believe in you, and then, give them the facts to reinforce that initial reaction. So what does that mean in practice? I think that, over the years, we've talked about ourselves as being really important for climate, then it's really important for jobs, then it's really important for, cost, then it's really important for climate again. And actually, I think we need to get a consistent narrative, right? And the consistent narrative is that, the world of the future needs huge quantities of reliable, affordable energy. And by investing in renewable energy in your market, you are future-proofing your economy by securing inside your own country your ability to produce those huge quantities of clean, reliable, affordable energy. You are, if you do it in the right way, creating jobs and opportunities, which are long-term, well-paid, quality jobs, very often unionised jobs as well, if that matters to you. And you are stimulating investment in infrastructure that will keep your economy going for, the next several generations. And in doing that, you're also preserving then the other assets that are out there in the economy that rely upon that energy coming in. So we talk about the conservative agenda. You're helping conserve those asset values. And I think that's a constant message that doesn't change. I think really what we should be appealing to is the national interest. It is the security agenda. It is the concept of nation building, because that's exactly what we're doing. And if we can get that argument somehow right and somehow to land, we don't need to be a football in this political game that seems to be, attached to the left liberal woke agenda. Actually, we're just as relevant and just as important at every part of the political spectrum if we can just keep that messaging in the right place and quite consistent. So I think that's the challenge for us. But to do that, we have to A, get the message right, and B, we've got to be willing to go and share it with people outside our own industry and start talking in identifiable terms to people that aren't working in wind energy right now. The people who are in the industry, they know how great it is. It's the other people that we need to worry about. It's the people who read the right-wing press or who, are nervous about the impact that this is all going to have on ratepayers' bills and all that kind of thing. Those are the people we've got to go and somehow convince that this is the way forward.
There's definitely more work to be done, and it's probably something that you and I should need to continue the conversation a bit longer. But on that note, we've seen the oil and gas companies pull back significantly. In one area that we're focused on is who else can we bring in from outside the circle, or the industry that can either fill those shoes or really carry the baton and really contribute to continue to drive the energy transition and offshore wind and what we need to do. Maybe in that context, I'll ask you a question that I always like to ask, as we kind of wrap things up. Give us a little bit, a couple of your predictions as we kind of, look to beyond this turbulent times, specifically around oil and gas companies and who will replace them, if any, in this industry, specifically offshore wind in the U.S. What's going to happen? Are we ever going to see offshore wind in the U.S.? Some people doubt it, but others, obviously have different views. And then the last one around Chinese turbines in the Western world. We've seen some traction there, but are we going to see a significant market share growth? And that's been something that some of those manufacturers have been working on for quite some time. So maybe I'll leave those with you to give us some thoughts on your predictions.
Okay, there's a lot in there, Philip. So on the oil and gas side, so my view on this is that there are a lot of complementary skills from oil and gas companies and offshore wind specialist companies, but there isn't necessarily a complementary business model. And I think if you look at the oil and gas companies, whether that's at the developer level or at the supply chain level, it's probably the ones who sort of ring-fenced the business unit that looks at offshore wind and allowed a business model that had the same sort of level of discipline and rigor and patience and return expectations that you need to do well in this industry. They're the ones that stay in. And I think that's probably, the way to look at it. In my opinion, looking over the next few years, offshore wind is retreating a bit back onto the balance sheets of big utility players or oil and gas companies, but mostly utility players, because they're the ones that have the patient balance sheets with relatively low cost of capital that can hold on to things through the cycle. And even if it takes a bit longer, it's a strategic long-term, part of their business, and therefore they carry on with it. And that's where the industry's dropping back to. I think, though, what that means is that those big utilities, their balance sheets only go so far, and they'll start to focus, they already are starting to focus on core technologies and core markets. And that means that if you're in a developing market, or you're trying to promote a technology which has any novelty to it, then it's going to be difficult to get that kind of attention. And I think that's a cycle you might see recurring over the life of the energy transition, which means I think what you might see is the more promotion of national champions and getting more, national capable industrial players shoehorned into these sectors much earlier, working with the big Western utilities and all the big, the experts you need who have the skills, but somehow allowing that continuity in each local market to carry on through these cycles. Because I think what you can't have is too often, big organisations coming in and stepping out again, depending on the market conditions. So that's where I think you're going to see that the successor to oil and gas will be national champions who are some kind of big industrial, big infrastructure player, could be state-owned, could be private, but somehow encouraged to play a big role in each of their own markets. On the US, I mean, I'm eternally optimistic, by the way. I think in this industry, if you're not an optimist, you don't get out of bed in the morning, right? So it's hard to see how much is going to happen in the next 3 or 4 years, let's be honest, given the level of reliance there is on some kind of federal activity that's either supportive or at least not destructive. And so I think you're going to see a real slowdown, that's for sure. But if you come back to the fundamentals, and the fact is that in those northeastern states, offshore wind offers a huge opportunity in providing those massive quantities of power right into the coastal demand centres without disrupting onshore in terms of transmission upgrades and other things like that. And it can create a lot of jobs and opportunities that plays very well into those kind of local industrial agendas. I really believe it will come back. And I guess what we need to try and do as an industry and state by state with governors is be as patient and as supportive as we can to try and keep as much of those assets alive. The good news for offshore wind in the US right now is actually most of the players that are there are really big, serious, long-term players globally. And so they're not the kind of players that cut and run. And so hopefully you can, you'll see that being the case over the next few years. And then on Chinese turbines, you're really making me work for my supper here, Philip. I think that the market of offshore wind needs sufficient volume of turbine suppliers to allow it to continue to grow. So there needs to be a healthy competition there. There's probably is room for 3 or 4 players in the market for sure. And so that means that there is room potentially for, 1 or 2 other new players to be in. And logically, the only place that's going to come from is from Chinese suppliers. There are also, by the way, certain markets that are quite well suited to Chinese turbines because of low wind speeds and other environmental factors. And there are markets where maybe the big Western OEMs are not actually that active yet and not showing that much interest in being active. So it's not to say, that the Chinese turbines will only be in China or they have to be in Central Europe. They can be in other parts of the world and grow into the sector from that point of view. But whatever happens, I think it has to be done in a rational way. I think the big issue actually for Chinese turbines, being candid about it, is that the technology is probably very good, right? And the companies that are promoting this technology are very good in terms of R&D and all the rest of it. The bit which is going to, I think, stretch them is the project execution capabilities in the Western markets and the kind of operation and maintenance capabilities in those markets to the same really high standard you get from the big Western suppliers. And so probably in the early years, if anyone's bringing Chinese turbines into the market, it's most likely to be done successfully by a big, capable client who can actually sit with that supplier and help them into the market rather than something else. So, because I think that, for these things to become bankable, they need the first few projects to go well from an execution capability. So I believe that Chinese turbines will start selling more and more outside of China, probably not necessarily straight into the big Western markets because of the desire you see from the existing turbine manufacturers to continue to be very successful there. But eventually, I think you'll see the market settle in a world where there's enough for everyone, and the Chinese players have proven themselves to come into those markets. And by the way, I do hope if that happens, that it doesn't happen at the expense of the Western suppliers. And I really hope that there's enough support, fiscal support and regulatory support for those suppliers from the European Union and the other governments to keep them as healthy and as competitive as they can. Because I do think that it's important for the energy transition that we keep this well-balanced, well-diversified global supply chain, and that the technology does not all reside in one part of the world. I think that's really important that we can somehow protect that. And so my remarks about thinking that the Chinese turbines will eventually become part of the landscape is not at all saying that I hope they dominate, because I think that would not be a good thing for any market if that was to be the case.
I'd love to hear any key message or thoughts specifically for investors looking at investing in offshore wind, whether in existing assets or, new projects. Any key messages or thoughts, over these next couple of years?
Well, right. So, I mean, existing assets, I think it's a relatively straightforward value proposition. You can see the track record of the asset and how well it's being operated, and most of them are. And they're probably, as most big offshore projects have got good, stable tariffs or some kind of, instrument to sell the power in a stable long-term way. So these remain highly investable opportunities, and it's a good way to get into the market and to understand it. Buying into new stuff, I think you really need to look very carefully at the market that you're in and what the regulatory framework is looking like and how quickly that's being adapted to suit what's needed going forward. I think what's happened a lot in our market is that a lot of private equity has went into projects early with an assumption that that would be recycled with debt at a particular point in time as the project got built. And then that didn't happen because of all sorts of macroeconomic and regulatory reasons. And that equity gets trapped there and it doesn't get recycled and it doesn't earn the return it's meant to earn. And that starts to undermine confidence and it starts to, affect your ability to then to recycle that equity into other projects. So I think speeding up the process and particularly looking at markets where that process looks like it is speeding up is a really important feature, I think, so that you don't end up with money being trapped somewhere for the long term, because that's not what private investors are looking for, I don't think.
Yeah, absolutely. We're still seeing a lot of interest in existing operating assets for sure, like you said, with track record, predictable returns and so on. So very good. Jonathan, we're out of time. I'm sure we could continue for another hour, but thank you so much for taking the time and really sharing your insights. I just want to thank you again.
Good pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on, Philip. And really enjoyed the conversation.